Hello, everyone. My name is Bradley J., and welcome to the Revolution 250 podcast. Revolution 250 is an organization dedicated to commemorating events that led up to the American Revolution. And I believe Bob Allison, Professor Bob Allison of Suffolk University, is the chair of the organization. He joins us today as the host of the podcast. And we're also joined by Emily A. Murphy, who is a specialist in early American decorative and material culture, and also currently works for the National Park Service as curator of the Salem Maritime National Historic Site. And we have Jim Hollister, too, who is a park ranger. I want to learn more about being a park ranger with the U.S. National Park Service, Minuteman National Historical Park. We'll find out about that. And Jim entered the service in 2002. So welcome all to the podcast. We'll have the chairperson, Bob Allison, kick this off with a question.
Thank you. Thanks, Bradley. And thank you, Jim and Emily, for joining us today. And
Pleasure.
It's great to have you. And Emily, can you tell us a little bit about Salem and its part in the Revolution, what we can learn from Salem as we're looking at the American Revolution?
Absolutely. I think Salem is a really interesting study in sort of the reactions to the American Revolution. It tended to be a more conservative town. There were a lot of very wealthy families who had made a lot of money off of international trade. And a lot of these families were very invested in the British Empire and the status quo. And they had been in control of the town for many, many years. And then there was a group of sort of upcoming families, including the Darby family, who had made a bunch of money in trade and were very much associated with the Patriot cause. And so that dynamic playing out in the late 1760s is a really interesting sort of microcosm of how the smaller, the outside of Boston, smaller towns and port communities. We really didn't have as much of the street action, as it were, that Boston did. But there were a few of these instances. And then, of course, in 1774, when General Gage arrives, he actually moves the capital of Massachusetts to Salem because it's seen as a less contentious place than Boston was at the time. Of course, once the war actually begins, Salem's biggest contribution to the war effort is the privateering that happens in town. And Salem was the most successful privateering port in America, many claim, during the American Revolution. And one statistic that I've heard is about 150 ships come out of Salem and capture in total over 500 British vessels, which is economically, that's a huge hit to British trade. And they're capturing these vessels, not around Salem. They're capturing these vessels in the English Channel. They're capturing these vessels in the Caribbean, like right where British trade is the most important. So Salem has a really interesting history with the American Revolution that is often not heard about much.
How separated was Salem from Boston and the events in Boston? We take the train now, no big deal. It's, I don't know, half an hour. But then how long did it take to get there? And how much communication was there? And how separate were the events in the two places?
There was actually quite a bit of communication between the two. People were going back and forth from Salem to Boston quite a bit. It was a couple of hours by road. Likewise, an hour and a half, 2 hours maybe if the wind was right, by boat. So there was a lot of movement between the two cities, and often, folks who were trading, they'd be heading down to the Caribbean, working their way back up the coast. They'd hit Boston and then come to Salem. So we're very much aware of what's going on in Boston here, and we're very much aware of the debates in Boston. And in fact, that's one of the interesting things is that, again, Salem sort of slow reaction time is very frustrating to people in Boston. They're trying to get, Salem is the #2 city in Massachusetts, and they're trying to get us involved. And, and we insist on having these town meetings that go on and on and on. And then, they're like, well, maybe we'll just deal with this next week. And the folks in Boston are like, but the big meeting is tomorrow. We need to have delegates. And, so Salem just, there's this sort of, has this very slow response time in a lot of things. And it is very frustrating.
Now, Jim, you work in a place that does have a connection, we all understand, with Revolution, Minuteman. Can you tell us a little bit about Minuteman National Park?
Oh, certainly. So Minuteman National Historical Park, it actually, runs through 3 towns, starting in the eastern part of the park in Lexington, at the sort of the western border of Lexington, running west through the town of Lincoln and into Concord. And so the park was created in 1959 to commemorate the events of April 19th, 1775, which of course is the date of the first battle, Lexington and Concord. So what the work that was going into creating the park was actually trying to recover the battlefield from more modern development through the 19th and into the 20th century. We have the North Bridge Unit, which of course has been preserved, since as a historic site since the 1830s. But the Battle Road, where a lot of the heavy fighting that took place as the British column was heading back to Boston, took place along the Battle Road, or the Bay Road as it was called then. And that road, was largely still in use as the North Great Road, as Route 2A, Mass Ave. So it had been developed over the centuries. And so the Park Service, starting in the early 60s, had to purchase properties along the road, remove them when appropriate, and restore parts of the battlefield so that people can actually visit these places where this incredibly important historic event occurred. So that was the work of decades. It wasn't like a one and done, and one of the things I really love about the Park Service is that we take our time on things. Theoretically, a park should be forever. And so when they're purchasing properties, families, some of them relocated right away, some took extended leases, some even took life tenancy. So really, the work of restoring the battlefield continued right up through the early 2000s. And in many ways, it's an ongoing process as we continue some selective clearing of some of the fields. One of the things that a lot of people don't realize about the battlefield in 1775 is that it was mostly open farmland. It's more wooded now than it was in 1775. So in addition to removing modern structures and also restoring parts of the roadway, because there were some parts of the old Battle Road that had become secondary roads over the years. So we were able to close them down to traffic, pull up the pavement and restore them, but also do some selective clearing and reopen the old farm fields. And really what's amazing, it's every time we do that, it's like revealing a lost world. You see, some of the stone walls and farm lanes and part of the built environment of 1775. And it really, like some parts of the park, like walking past Hartwell Tavern in Lincoln, it's like you're there. It really does evoke the past, unlike many other places along the Battle Road today. But of course, April 19th, 1775 is an iconic event. Everybody knows something about it. Of course, this is where the petitions and the protests give way to military preparations, the provincial Congress meeting out in Concord in late 1774 and into 1775, stockpiling arms. And of course, Concord was one of the major magazines or supply depots. And General Gage knows this through his spy network. And he's also under a lot of pressure to do something about it, that Massachusetts was out of control. So he sent 700 soldiers on an expedition from Boston out to Concord. It's a distance of about 18 miles. And the goal was to get to Concord, to seize and destroy the weapons, and hopefully return to Boston before the colonists would have a chance to react. And that went out the window almost from the time they landed in Cambridge to begin their march. So as we know, the alarm riders, Paul Revere, William Dawes, and dozens of others had been spreading throughout the countryside. And the Minutemen, the militia, responded in great numbers by the hundreds, and later in the day by the thousands, and were driving them back from Concord all the way back to Boston in a long, bloody running battle. So that's what we commemorate, you know, that transition from politics to warfare that really kind of put the colonies on the path towards independency 14 months later. So.
Minuteman Park is named after the Minutemen who were ready to fight in a minute. But in your experience, is that possible? I mean, is that just a figure of speech? I mean,
yeah, for the most part. So it's not in a minute, it's at a minute's notice. So yeah, it is really,
okay.
I can tell you, you know, whenever, you know, one of my main duties at the park is living history. So yeah, it takes me longer than a minute to get dressed, or even if I am already dressed and, you know, all the buttons and
yes,
getting armed, you know.
And where's my ammunition belt? Oh my God, you know,
yeah,
to keep things all together.
Yeah, so the wording, when a lot of these towns raised their Minuteman companies, the wording was, you know, at the shortest possible notice or at a minute's warning.
Okay.
So you receive the alarm, you have your stuff ready, and you get to the place of rendezvous where your company's going to meet. You get there as quickly as you can.
So what do you have to bring with you when you form up for some pre-revolutionary event or a revolutionary event? What, as a person who does this and works with people who do it, what's the stuff you have to bring with you?
Well, it was actually prescribed by law. So you had to have, and there was a phrase that they used quite frequently back then that would seem very strange to modern ears: armed as according to law. So the militia laws in Massachusetts were very specific about what militiamen were required to have. And of course, all men between the ages of 16 and 60 were required to serve in the militia. And from among them, there were many that volunteered to serve in these Minuteman companies. So what you had to have first, of course, is your musket. But they even say the barrel of the musket has to be not less than 3.5 feet long. So they're really getting specific. You also had to have 20 bullets sized to fit your gun, a pound of good powder. You had to have some kind of bladed weapon like a cutting sword or a bayonet. Bayonets were sort of the ideal, though in 1775, there were many Minutemen and militiamen who were lacking. So they came out with other things like a cutting sword or even a tomahawk, a hatchet, would at least allow them to not have to pay the fine if they were deficient. And then, of course, you also had to have a knapsack with a day's rations and a blanket and a canteen, of course. So, you know, this was the stuff that you were responsible for. Even if you were serving in a militia company, you're responsible to train 6 days a year, but you would be inspected. And they would make note of all the stuff that you have and what you don't have. And if you were deficient, you'd have to pay heavy fines. And then if you join a Minuteman company, there's a big push to make sure that all the Minuteman companies were properly equipped. Get them the cartridge boxes where they keep their ammunition. Get them bayonets if possible. Make sure that they are going to be the best trained, best equipped, the elite of the militia.
And they were all responsible for purchasing this stuff on their own? Pretty much?
Yes, they were. That was your obligation according to colonial law. And like in the militia, for example, suppose you turn 16, now you have to serve. So you were given 3 months from your 16th birthday to appear fully equipped. And if you couldn't, sometimes the town would loan you the gear that you needed, but you'd have to put up some kind of security. You know, whether it was money or produce from the farm, so many bushels of corn, kind of a rent-to-own system. But yeah, you were responsible for it.
Bob?
I want to ask Emily, if we were to go to Salem, what can we see from the Revolution? What are there buildings or there sites you would recommend?
Well, there's one, of course, with COVID right now, a lot of the historic structures in Salem are closed. But under normal circumstances, one of the places is here at Salem Maritime, the Derby House, which was built in 1762 by Richard Derby Sr., who was the captain and one of the wealthiest men in town at that time. And he built it as a wedding present for his son, Elias Haskett Derby. And while Haskett and his wife, Elizabeth Crowninshield, were living in that house, that was when Haskett became one of the major owners of privateers in the U.S. One historian estimates that almost 5% of all American privateering was being run out of that house. So it's set up as a wealthy merchant's house of the pre-war period would have. There are, unfortunately, there's not a lot. Unlike Concord, there aren't a lot of specific sites related to privateering because most of that action happens on the sea. Derby Wharf is one of the last remaining original 18th century wharves in Salem. That also is at Salem Maritime. And that was the Derby family wharf that many of these privateers would have left from. The Peabody Essex Museum here in Salem does have quite a few things from the Revolutionary era and the families who lived here, including the Ropes Mansion, which is one of a home that belonged to the Ropes family, and Judge Ropes was one of these old families that I talked about earlier, who were very much part of the controlling the loyalist families, and the story is that there was actually a riot in front of Judge Ropes's house, and he was dying of smallpox at the time, and everybody says that it killed him because he had agreed to serve as a judge at a time when people were trying to get the judges to resign because they were going to be paid by the crown and not by the Massachusetts legislature. So he was one of the ones who had agreed to serve the crown. So there's a couple of sites like that. I mean, and many of the sort of streets in Salem have survived, intact from that period. But places like Leslie's Retreat happened at our North Bridge, which was the bridge over the North River, which has now been replaced by 114, which is the major entrance to Salem. So that has not survived.
Now, there is a reenactment at Leslie's Retreat every year in February, isn't there?
Yes. That's a big community event that one of the organizations in town has been working on. It's a lot of fun. I don't know if you want me to go over the history of Leslie's Retreat, but that's that is our big sort of armed event in Salem that happened during the American Revolution.
Now, Emily,
go ahead.
I've seen you presenting as Elias Haskett Derby's better half. And I wonder, I know both of you have a lot to say about the role of women in the Revolution. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more.
Certainly. So there's a very, like as with men, there is a variety of ways that women participated in the revolutionary world, and a lot of that is determined by socioeconomic class and by race. So for folks who are of the lower sort, the working classes, which would have included enslaved women, it was okay for them to participate in the street culture of the time, because those women in the 18th century, those women were not considered to have any reputations to lose. So if they were out there on the street throwing things, that was not going to damage people's opinion of them any further than it already had, just because they were poor. But for sort of the middle class white women particularly, and the upper class white women, it was much more difficult because they were very much circumscribed by legal and societal pressures. And so for a lot of these women, it became part consumerism. So the idea of the boycott that comes out, particularly after the Stamp Act, and then continues throughout the 1760s and early 1770s. The idea that women can not buy tea, not buy clothing, as the people who were making a lot of these decisions in the household, they were a targeted audience for a lot of these things. And then in the late 1760s, the sort of the white upper class equivalent of a street protest are these public spinning bees that start happening, particularly in 1768 and 1769, where you have large groups of women gathering publicly on the green or some public place in a town and spinning, like doing a full day's spinning. It's usually hosted by the minister, the women who, many of whom will have never spun before in their lives because they live in port communities and all their fabric's imported. So they sit there and they work their way through mostly flax, but also some cotton seems to be the two big things that are being spun at these spinning bees, and occasionally wool, but most often linen and cotton. And so they're producing, sort of supporting the homespun movement. It's not producing enough, fabric to make up for the, for the importation, but it's a great public display of allegiance to the patriot cause.
We're with Emily Murphy and Jim Hollister of the Park Service, National Park Service Curator for Salem Maritime National Historic Site. That's Emily. And Jim Hollister, Park Ranger, and works with the Minuteman National Historic Park. And Bob Allison, Suffolk University professor and the chair of Revolution 250. Just one more question to add on to that one. Any events, pre-revolutionary events, Emily, that took place in Salem that are undersung and people should know about?
Well, I think one of them is Leslie's Retreat. I think it's I think it's very important to know that the events of April 19th, the events that Jim and his park talk about, did not happen in a vacuum. There's this sort of idea that all of a sudden the British showed up and then the regulars marched out to Concord and the countryside rose up. But it's actually part of a series of increasingly violent confrontations between the American citizens and the British regulars as they're coming into town. So in February of 1775, the regulars heard that there were stockpiles being gathered in Salem for the purpose of defending the colony. And as a port with a lot of ships, a lot of these ships would run armed because of piracy and privateers from other countries. And so there were a lot of cannon wandering around Salem. So some of these were being gathered up. And so Colonel Alexander Leslie came out from Boston, and came to Salem to collect these stores. And there was a confrontation between the redcoats and the citizens of Salem at the North Bridge. And it was one of these points at which the balance could have tipped, and because there were militia coming in from all over to defend the area, and they finally reached a compromise. Depending on who you talk to, on which version you hear, it was either one of the ministers or it was Timothy Pickering who came up with this idea to march, have them drop the drawbridge, march over the drawbridge, turn around and march back, so that they could say they had looked everywhere in Salem. So they'd even been to North Salem, and then they went back out, and then Colonel Leslie got court-martialed for not completing his orders. But I think that also kind of betrays the fact that Gage himself was really trying not to raise the countryside by seeming to be too aggressive in these maneuvers. And the fact that, you know, when Colonel Smith goes out, it is a colonel, right, Jim? He is a colonel.
Lieutenant Colonel.
Lieutenant Colonel. Oh, so when he leaves, you know, in Boston in April, he's given orders to find what he's looking for.
So I was going to ask Jim, and I think Emily anticipated it. So what changes between February and April?
Well, it's very interesting. So, you know, you see a lot of, like a good example would be the powder alarm that happens in September of '74, where General Gage successfully retrieves, you know, 250 half barrels of powder from the magazine in Charlestown. And that prompted a very large response from the militia. I mean, several thousand appear, you know, on the date of the raid and in the following day as well. And you see a lot of the Patriot leadership trying to kind of cool the temperature down a little bit. But, you know, as the fall gives way to the winter, and you do see occasions like, you know, the proposed raid on Fort William and Mary up in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where General Gage was going to anticipate a Patriot move and remove military supplies, but of course Patriots went and it actually attacked the fort, and there was an exchange of fire. That was in December of '74. Then the mission to Salem that Emily just detailed in February, again, looking for artillery, because General Gage knows that they're gathering artillery, they're gathering muskets and supplies, and their goal was to equip a colonial army of 15,000 men. So this is very, very serious. And so Gage is running out of options. And, you know, what he's hearing back from his superiors in London is that, you know, he needs to take action. That, you know, okay, if everything that you're describing to us is true, you have an actual rebellion on your hands. You need to take action. So, you know, really, you know, by that point, everybody is now, the thing that everybody wanted to avoid, they're now ready. And General Gage knows of a large supply of arms in Concord, including 4 pieces of brass artillery that were smuggled out of Boston that he really wants to get his hands on. And there are reports that those were in Concord, along with many other supplies. So, you know, really by that point, Gage is out of options. He's got to do something, and that's when he sends the 700 soldiers. But you still see this idea that, you know, maybe this isn't the real thing. But the fact that they're penetrating so deeply out into the countryside is a real wake-up call. One of the unintended consequences, General Gage sent out a party of officers on horseback the evening before. And their purpose was to stop any intelligence of the march getting out, to stop the alarm riders. But everybody who reports seeing those riders so far into the countryside, I mean, out through Lexington, into Lincoln, everybody who sees them is like, there's something wrong. Something's going to happen. And then, of course, suppose you're living in Lexington, you wake up in the middle of the night, Revere has come through, and later Dawes, saying the regulars are coming. It's confirming all of your fears. But even still, as the regulars are coming through, Captain John Parker, commanding the Lexington Militia Company, what does he do? You know, if you're in his position, so they know the regulars are coming out. Is this really going to be the start of a war? Nobody knows. Could it be a situation like, you know, what happened at in Salem, where they stop, they discuss, they come to an agreement, the regulars turn around? Who knows? Are they going to search house to house, looking for Samuel Adams and John Hancock? We don't know. So he parades his company on the town green. And as he says, we determined not to meddle or make with the British soldiers, nor to be discovered unless they should insult us or threaten them. And of course, it all goes wrong, because this time is different. And so when the regulars are coming out, there's some shots fired as they're approaching the green. Somebody off the green, potentially a very poorly timed warning shot, but the regulars just go at them. The officers lose control of their men, and now there's bloodshed. And you could reasonably make the case that at that point, Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith could have said, okay, you know, this has gotten out of hand. We're going to go back to Boston. But he doesn't. And he continues several miles further up into the country to Concord on his mission to seize and destroy the weapons. So had everything gone well, you know, he would have shown his resolve, you know, show the flag, if you will, that yes, we are going to come out there. We do have the ability to strike you. We do have the ability to seize and destroy weapons and, you know, to return before you have a chance to respond. But of course, it all goes very, very wrong. In Concord, of course, they were met with the militia who were very under control. That's the thing that a lot of people don't realize is just how under control the militia was. There's a great account of the British as they enter Concord and they see a couple of companies of militia on a hill as they're entering town. And, excuse me, they send some soldiers up that hill to drive them off. And instead of running in panic at seeing the sight of redcoat soldiers coming against them, the militia just very calmly turned to the right about and marched in front of them. And one British officer, Lieutenant John Barker, said, "We thought they would have made a stand there, but they did not choose it." You know, which is really fascinating because what you see is they're picking their ground, they're picking their time until they get more reinforcements coming in from other towns. Till you get to about 9:30 in the morning, and they're standing on a hill overlooking the North Bridge. They number now over 400 men. And when they see smoke rising above the town, what was really happening was the British soldiers in town following orders to seize and destroy stockpiles of arms, but they were also under specific orders not to harm the inhabitants or private property. Well, as they're burning a stockpile of military supplies, the flames spread to the townhouse. That catches on fire. The British soldiers are putting it out, but there's no way for the militia on the hill to know that. They assume the town is being destroyed. So that it really kind of comes down to that one moment. And there's really, there was some physical evidence left of that moment where they realize they're going into combat. And the Concord Museum has several of these pieces. They're gun flints, and they were discovered in the late 1930s by an amateur archaeologist who was looking for Native American stone tools. And he was out in that field where the militia stood, and it had just been plowed for the first time in decades. And what he found instead were 200 gun flints arranged in two ranks. And really, you can imagine these men standing there looking at smoke rising above Concord and going, I don't think we're getting out of this. You know, this is not some public relations mission. We're going into battle. And so anyone who is less than confident about the sharpness of their flint or the, you know, how well their weapon is going to work, they're changing their flints. That means they know they're going into action. So, you know, it kind of builds up until that flashpoint. And of course, they're hearing reports throughout the morning of what happened in Lexington. Some of them said that there were shots fired only, but then they're getting more reports that people have been killed. So they're sort of getting bits and pieces of news as the morning unfolds while they're dealing with what's directly in front of them.
Excellent story. Before we go, could both of you talk a little, just a very short amount of time about projects or initiatives that you're involved in, maybe fundraising or working up towards some event? Emily? Well, let's start with Jim. Okay, go ahead, Emily. Looks like you were muted.
No,
Now
that's
you're
okay.
good.
Okay, so one of the things that we will be we're looking at is in 2024 doing a British encampment. We've done these before a few years back, and they've been a lot of fun where we basically reenact General Gage's moving the legislature to Salem, and he came here with 2 units of British soldiers, And so we get the reenactors to come down and set up on Derby Wharf, and they do the type of encampment that they would have done here in Salem. They were actually out at the very tip of the peninsula at a fort that's out there, the new fort it was called. And then they were also in Danvers at one of the merchants' homes that Gage had rented out there. So that's I'm looking forward to that one that's coming up.
Excellent.
And then meanwhile, of course, there's the annual Leslie's Retreat
Jim?
that's done by the town.
What are you working on?
Well, we have a really good relationship with the local reenactment community. So before COVID hit, we were building on our signature event, which is Battle Road, where we recreate. We have a British column, about 100 or so, marching down an original section of the Battle Road. They deploy their flankers out on the sides. There's firing from the tree line. It's very exciting. It draws thousands of people. We also have a civilian evacuation where we have people portraying men, women, and children who are not combatants who were fleeing their homes. So it's really sort of just a storytelling on a grand stage. So we're continuing our work with them, doing new research. Like we now know when we do our Parker's Revenge Battle Road scenario, we can take the Lexington Militia Company, the reenactors who portray them, and put them on the actual ground where they stood because of a recent archaeological study that was done that found the battle site. So we're building on the research of the past. We've also been working on our clothing standards to make sure that what we're putting out there is the best in terms of safety, because we're dealing with real firearms, but also authenticity and research, that they're all historians, and they're also very good interpreters. So we're continuing with that and hopefully going to expand the event to include other places in the park, some sections of the Battle Road in Lincoln, and really gearing up for the 250th, because it's going to be a big show, and we can't wait until 2025 and say, oh my goodness, we should do something bigger. So we've been building the groundwork now.
Excellent. And as far as the Revolution 250 events, I see at the website, there's a Revolutionary War Militia Muster in Newburyport and an Indigenous History Conference in Powwow, the Plymouth 400 Indigenous History Conference. And that has been switched to a virtual event. Am I accurate on that, Bob?
Yes.
Sweet. All right. Thank you all, Jim, Emily, and Bob. Excellent job. That's it for this episode of the Revolution 250 podcast. I'm looking forward to the next one.
Great.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.